Alright, I've hit start recording.
All right.
We actually got a warning that
Yeah,
time.
you
I'm
actually
impressed.
told us that time.
We're learning as we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Speech Bubbles, a webcomic podcast by people who do webcomics for people who want to do for people who want to do webcomics, read webcomics, or do webcomics. I'm Brent, I do the webcomic Paradise.
I'm Amber. I do the webcomic Backlash.
And I'm Jeff, and I do the webcomic farm with a Y.
And I don't know if you can tell, we're in rare form today. Um, we've been battling some technical difficulties and weird recording schedules, and we're all. It's just gonna be a real chill episode today about pacing
Mhm.
and webcomic time, which are two enemies of webcomic creators.
Eternal rival.
Pacing being, of course, how quickly or slowly the events of a story unfold, and webcomic time kind of being an abstract comment or concept referring to like the fact that webcomics are basically drip fed to the readers over years and years usually. Man, my words are not happening real good today. Hopefully by the end of the podcast I'll be able to talk like a normal human.
Oh man.
How do you guys feel about these things that we're going to talk about?
Well, I think I definitely have a bit to say about pacing. So I find it very interesting, especially when everyone's always saying "Hey man, I really like how you paced your prologue there. It's really good." I'm like, "Oh, yeah. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just doing it." I mean, it's I guess it's a thing I kind of subconsciously understand, but I didn't really put a lot of thought into it. Wow, I'm tripping on my words too, Brent. Sorry. I didn't put a lot of thought into it until more recently, especially since we were going to talk about this pretty soon. I was like, actually, let me think on it for a minute here. So I find it very interesting, and I definitely think it's something that you have to be very conscious about when you're making webcomics, especially if you're planning on printing said webcomic someday. Because reading it in print versus reading it online is a very different thing. Especially if each page has a cliffhanger at the end of it or something like that.
Oh man, see that's what's really weird, and what makes writing pacing in your webcomic really difficult, because you can update your comic however you want with your webcomic. You could update it in batches with a couple pages every time. You could upload it one page a week, or just spoon feed it one at a time, or you could do whole chapters, and that kind of determines how your pacing is going to go, because webcomics have this weird thing where if you are doing it a page a week, you kind of need to do at the end of each page a zinger or a cliffhanger or something that will get people to want to come back again for the next one. But you also have to account for people who are binge reading your comic through the archive and have it flow nicely for them too. And it's really hard to get it to work in both ways. Webcomics are hard. Yeah. Writing comics is really hard.
Yeah, pacing in webcomics can be kind of hard to get a beat on depending on how much content of the webcomic is out there, whether or not you binge read it or you've been reading it a page a week over years or whatever. And it can be kind of hard to tell how a webcomic paces itself. In general, is a real goofy thing. And it's something whether you're kind of aware of it or not, you are wrestling with it a little bit. So, yeah.
I think the longer you do it, the more aware and a better sense for it you'll get, because it is different than making comics in any other format. It's a very weird, webcomics have a very weird specific problem with writing and pacing and all of that.
I feel like we should emphasize though, we're purely talking like narrative comics here, as opposed to something like a gag strip comic.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
So I felt like
Gag-A-Day strip comics are like mostly gonna be like getting that joke happening. Basically,
Writing
mean,
like,
I hope so.
yeah,
writing good jokes is another topic.
the pacing. We're talking about like pacing in long form story comics.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't think that like joke comics or strip comics have quite the same problem.
Although actually, it's interesting. I just got the physical copy of the book I donated to the Kickstarter. I got the Sakana for Volume One, and it's got some
Hmm.
stuff about how Mad Rupert does comics in the back of it, and she talks about Sakana. If you haven't read it, it's like a slice of life about like a fish market, and it's kind of done in like this strip format as opposed to these full kind of like 8 by 10 pages. And is interesting in the back of this physical volume. She talks about like ending each strip on something, whether it's a joke or a plot revelation or a character introduction or something. Um, every strip is punctuated with the like quote unquote gag, but the gag isn't always a joke, which is something I thought was really interesting.
yeah, that was always something very unique about Sakana and taking that format. I've only read one other like comic strip on the internet that kind of captured the strip feel, but
Mhm.
sometimes would tell like actual progressive stories through multiple strips.
Mhm.
And I think that was called Sequential Art by Jolly Jack. And it's not something that's done very often, so I actually do see it happen. It's
Mhm.
I think a unique way of telling stories, and it certainly looks like it takes less work.
Didn't Octopus Pie
Um,
kind of do this too? A little bit. It like
Ah,
I think it evolved and changed over the long time it's been around, but I feel like the earlier pages were a lot more like strip oriented.
I haven't read that yet, so I wouldn't
huh.
know.
It's a
I, I
doozy.
I think I haven't. I remember starting it way back, but I never really quite caught up because it's such a big comic.
It's
I
yeah.
think it was actually more. I think it was in the traditional page format.
Mm.
I could be wrong. I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, anyone. But I'm pretty sure it was in page format.
The whole thing of like, ending each page or strip with a gag of some sort, like that's not something that is only specific to like strip comics though, because like a lot of web comics that I read, like even the like long narrative ones, usually they have something like at least a joke on a page,
Mhm.
even if it's not like the last thing, or like something like ominous or something that like you want to end it with something so that people will come back and read the next one too.
The last panel is like the start of a
Wait,
sentence that
certain.
continues on the next page.
Yeah, stuff like that. Like, because you gotta,
Yeah.
it's, you don't have to do those kind of hooks with things that, like if you like updated a whole chapter at once, you'd just be like, okay, well, I kind of need to end my chapter on like a cliffhanger. But I
Mhm.
don't have to have
Yeah.
every single, like, you can kind of focus on making it flow a little nicer because you have a lot more like wiggle room.
Yeah. Um. Actually, just thinking about it now, I do remember. I'm trying to remember where I got this information from. It's probably a documentary or something, but I do remember it being said that at least for floppy comics, they did also have to kind of have those page turners on each page too, just because that's how they rope you in and make sure that you buy the comics and keep buying them
Mhm.
every month. So it has its pros to it, but certainly I don't think it necessarily always helps with the pacing. It depends how it's done, I guess. Um, like if it's maybe not a really big page turner, maybe just something that's like you said, like the tail end of a conversation or something like that. That's going to continue on to the next page. Then I think it's fine. But I certainly don't think that you should have at the end of every page like, "Ooh, look, shocking moment," or a
Yeah,
gag.
yeah.
Or,
I
Mhm.
mean, I don't mean that like that's like something that helps with pacing. Honestly, it kind of like if you were going to have it be printed in one big book, it probably doesn't really help with the pacing very much. It probably actually detracts from it. But that's just something that I've seen that people who make webcomics, it's just something they do, whether they like realize it or not, and it like is a technique to get people to keep coming back and stick it out with your long-term
Yeah,
webcomic.
what it is, it helps you in the short
yeah.
term as opposed like getting people to come back and read the next page and next week. But it
Hmm.
kind of it not necessarily does this, but it can goof up binge reading archives, and
Hmm.
that's it's a delicate balance.
Yeah, it's like giving something like that on a page. It's like a nice thing for your new readers or like the readers who are reading it as it updates because it's like, here's your special treat, and then it kind of can goof. Yeah, you're right. It can kind of goof it up for long sessions of reading. Yeah, it's a hard balance.
Especially for really long comics.
Yeah.
All right, you guys want to answer some cues? Give some A's to some Q's.
Actually, um,
Oh.
if we have a moment. Yeah,
Oh.
oh, yeah, that's right. I'm gonna stop you right there, pal.
Oh man, Jeff,
Jeff's taking the wheel.
Whoa.
take the floor, Jeff.
All right. Well, first off, I think I kind of want to emphasize some things on what some points here. First off, I think that in thinking of good examples, at least in terms of pacing, um, I actually look to films a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, beyond just books and comics. And I kind of wanted to share some examples. I think of relatively good paced movies that you could probably draw some inspiration from, depending on the genres you're kind of looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
And I only just limited down to three, but for fast paced, kind of like really intense action pacing, if you're writing an action comic, I think that uh, Mad Max Fury Road is a very good
I knew
example of
you were
Somehow
that.
I
gonna
knew
say
you were
Mad
gonna say
Max.
that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's not like I'm like a super big Mad Max fan or anything. Come on, guys. It's not like I've been talking about this entire. Yeah, all right, fine. But it is actually a very good example of very intense pacing because it does not let up. It does have moments where it slows down for a moment and lets you breathe for sure, but it always picks up the pace again and just keeps amping up over time.
Hmm.
And I think that's just, I mean, that's mostly due to how it's structured, the
Mm-hmm.
type of plot it follows. I mean, it is a big car chase. We can all be honest. It's just a
It's
big
a
car chase.
it's a big car
It's a
scene.
big car chase.
And then the music is also what really kind of drove that intensity as well.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you can't quite do that in comics
Yeah,
all the time.
pacing in films
But
can like make a 2 hour film feel like a hour and a half, and it can make like an hour and 45 minutes film feel like 3 hours. Like
Hmm.
yeah,
pacing in film is yeah. There's you know we've all probably seen some movies where we're sitting in the theater like, all right, that should have ended already. Like we've been going a little long, and then you get out and you look, it's like only been like an hour and a half, 2 hours. Like felt like you were in a fucking time chamber for days.
um, another example for those who want to write comedic comics, I would definitely recommend most films by Edgar Wright. I think he has great timing when it comes to telling jokes, whether it's slapstick or shock or all the others. I think he's got some great stuff in there, especially if you like Hot Fuzz. This is totally not me just like recommending great movies, you guys. I swear.
Okay, let's not kid ourselves. This whole podcast is just like low key, just recommending good stuff. So,
Yeah, all right.
You think at
Um,
this point, every episode, people are gonna come away with a list of like new things they should watch and read, and
this is good. Good. I think you should absorb other
that's
media
fine by
in order
me.
to
Yeah.
really fully understand. Yeah. This one I don't have as much experience with, but I believe Brent does.
Mhm.
It Follows. If you're looking for
Mm.
horror-based, dread-filled storytelling, one that kind of amps up over time and is slowly building up that feeling of dread and fear.
freaking, I still need to watch that movie.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know about me. I'm not a scare. I don't like scare moves.
It's got real
Um,
good cinematography, but it's also got really good tension. It's this constant like tense and and release over the course of the movie's runtime. That's really good.
yeah. Um, actually, that's an important thing about pacing. Actually, that's a segue, you guys. See what I'm doing there?
That's a
That's a segue.
segue.
I'm over explaining it because it's a joke.
No, we got it.
Uh, I know.
Seg that way, my friend.
All right. Well, I'm going to writing on my segue as I segue. Control is a very important part of pacing. I think we all understand that, and I think the best places I've actually seen that control is in Action Comics.
Hmm.
I brought this up before, but you should all go check out the Strip Panel Naked channel, please.
I've watched
And
those.
you should
Yeah, I
also
watched
take
those
a look.
videos you sent me about like Dread and stuff, and they were very, very good. Some of the
Yeah,
stuff about
yeah.
the Spider-Man one was
There's.
very good stuff in that.
Oh yeah, that's right. That one was great. Uh, the one I'm specifically going to be pointing out here is the one based on the Moon Knight comic, the more recent one,
Hmm.
and it's talking mostly about action and motion. Um, and the way that pacing is controlled in there is purely through the art, actually, not through words. And I think that's very important because I think that's where most of your pacing uh, trouble can come from. Because like when you're reading people talking, unless it's like a bunch of small bubbles or a bunch of text in one bubble, that's really going to like change up the pacing. And I think most of the time when you're reading, it's going to just slow down the pacing anyway.
Hmm.
But if you want to be able to control it visually, uh, that video actually had a lot of great examples, such as when you're trying to make an action appear faster or slower, it's dependent on whether or not you actually have a background. Because there's more information that your eyes are trying to kind of comb over in a single panel. Whereas like when it's just the character and the action and whatever it's focused on, that's literally all that's in that little bubble of focus or the panel, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And yeah, it's actually something I've kind of been taking to heart in my own comic, and well, I guess y'all will see soon enough. But it's
Hmm.
definitely one way of showing that control. Also, another thing is like since action is always usually movement based, it's also dependent on motion. And there's a good example of like depending on whether or not you're making your comic reading left or right, depending on which style you're going for. If you're moving in that direction that the reader is reading it in, and you're constantly pushing that motion forward, then that kind of helps the motion and the action kind of flow together and keeping this consistent momentum going. So I definitely think that's something you guys should check out. It also talks more about framing and stuff, but since we're mostly talking about pacing, I think action is definitely something to kind of take a look at. Um,
I'll link that
In the description.
in the description for people to go watch.
I know I'm talking a lot here, but there's just one more point I kind of wanted to touch on a little bit,
No,
if
keep
I may.
going.
Yeah, by all means.
All right. I kind of have talked to you guys about this a little bit days prior when we were having some technical difficulties and we can't really get to record.
Hmm.
But I think you can definitely notice the difference in pacing based on whether or not you're reading a Western or an Eastern comic. And I mean, like, in examples of, like, American comics, caped comics specifically,
Hmm.
we already kind of touched on the fact that they have a lot of those page turns because they're trying to keep you reading the comic. And it kind of doesn't always... It kind of futzes with the pacing a bit because they're also trying to push out a comic that's usually around, like, 24 or 30 pages, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I've picked up a floppy, but...
Yeah, about
It's usually
22 pages, I think, is
that's
typical.
yeah. It's like you have this like short amount of pages to put in your story for that month, and you're constantly racing against the clock to get that out there. Even though they have teams of people working on it, it's not giving a lot of time for things to breathe a lot of the time, I think. And as a result, it feels like Western comics, at least in the caped floppy style comics, it feels like the pacing's always just like boom, 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 super fast.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I feel like um, in Eastern comics, say like in Europe or mangas in Japan, I feel like they kind of give themselves a bit more time to actually extend their storyline so then they can control that pacing at a slightly slower pace.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with manga. I mean, I haven't seen a series that isn't like at least over maybe 50 volumes long. I mean, I only read so much, but like I know there's like a lot. There's usually a lot of volumes just for one story, and then each of those have like about 5 chapters within them with who knows how many pages in between each of those chapters. It feels like every time I pick up a volume, I have like a full like it's almost like graphic novel length of a story, and it's a part of a bigger story.
It's
So-
interesting you bring that up because, like, if you think about it, print comics generally only come out once a month. They're monthly. A lot of manga stuff, at least with Weekly Shonen Jump, is weekly, and manga chapters are still like somewhere between like 17 and 20 pages, a little bit. So in a year you're getting at max 12 chapters of a Western print comic, but in a year you're getting 4 times that in Weekly Shonen Jump. Obviously, like taking time for breaks and holidays and stuff like that. So and I mean, manga's crews are typically like a lot smaller, and they're kind of forced to work really fast, and they don't use color and stuff, and it's all one dude and some assistants. But the sheer volume of like story that they can tack on in the same amount of time, I think definitely affects how much they can screw around with pacing and not have be able to like take their time like with certain story beats as opposed to like keeping everything breakneck because they only have so much space they can do things with.
Yeah.
Also, just like maybe as a little underscore side note thing, with like comparing like Cape Comics and how like that is handled in the United States versus how like things like Shonen Jump and things like that, it's just like them writing that like their stories is very different because with the manga the artist like the creators have like creative control over their story and like those characters are theirs, but with like Cape Comics the writers have written for a bunch of different characters and those characters are never going to be their characters. They're just being hired to write something.
Yeah, it's the characters and stories that switch from artist to artist.
Yeah, so it's like kind of like a weird, and they can only do so much with what they're given. So just like that was just another little difference I was thinking about.
Maybe it's not a fair example for comparison, but I just wanted to kind of give that comparison in like how things are structured a little bit differently depending on where you read comics from. And it's not always the same in the Western comics. I mean, graphic novels and indie comics tend to not always be at breakneck pace.
Right.
And
they get to breathe a little more and also like focus more on emotion and mood than comics do.
All right. We've zoomed out a little bit. We'll zoom back in to our home turf, webcomics. And now you guys want to cue some A's, answer some Q's.
Yes,
I think you'll stop calling them Q's.
From at Joichi-chan. How do you handle enough buffer pages for posting? How does one handle scripts for webcomics? More panels or less panels?
Buffer pages.
Buffer page. That's a funny joke you put in your question.
I like the loudest round of applause for webcomic artists who are able to keep buffers. You guys are crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, my buffer tends to fluctuate between like doing it. I don't like doing it the pages the night before. A lot of times I do the page a couple days before, like I'm doing Friday's page the day after this recording session. Um, but like, I mean, there have been times when I've had like a couple weeks buffer, and it's easier to keep a buffer when you have less pages, when you're doing like 4 pages a month as opposed to 8 pages. 4 pages is like there's a real big difference between 4 and 8 pages. And having a month's worth of comics is real. It's a lot easier when you're doing 1 page a month.
Yeah.
My buffers always happen by accident. I just happened to be on a roll one day, and I'm like, oh, I'm 2 or 3 pages ahead. And then what happens is I'm like, oh, well, I don't have to worry about it for a week and a half. I fall off a little bit, and then I got to scramble to get that 4th page on the second week.
Well, and that's something that's like interesting with buffers. I think that I've thought about is just, you know, at what point is it like you don't really? It's not like a buffer. Like if you're focusing on, if you're stressing about getting a page done every time you post a page, is that really a buffer? Like if you're beating yourself up for not having like another page done once you put. I've seen people do this where they're like, oh no, I have like a 3-page buffer and I just posted one, so I'm down to 2 and I don't have time to make a new one, and they punish themselves for that, and I'm like, but the point of the buffer is that you can do that.
That you can just chill for like a week or 2.
Yeah. So like, you know, with me and buffers, we are not very good acquaintances. We have brushed each other on the street a couple times, like just in passing. I had like a 3-page buffer that I did for just to cover this like spring break period, so I could work on other stuff during it. But like, you know, my last page of that buffer went up today, and so I'm like, oh well, I need to do next Sunday's page now, and usually I'll do them the day before or the day of. Like, and I think maybe rules for buffers is individual basis, and you just need to know how you work.
Now here's something specifically relating to pacing about buffers. I find that whenever I do pages like in batches for buffers, like at like about 3 or more, what ends up happening is I do become like less precious with how much stuff I'm putting on the page. Like when I'm going week to week, I tend to like subconsciously start packing like my pages more and more with stuff. But when I'm doing them in batches, I find that I'm letting the little things breathe a little more, because I see them as like a stretch of 3 or 4 pages as opposed to page by page by page. And I think that can definitely affect how people are reading it.
Yeah. I definitely don't think I think that if you want a buffer for your comic, I think you should probably have. I think me and Brent talked about this once when I was trying to work out what I should do, but at least a month in advance, you'd say.
You mean before
maybe?
You start posting?
Or
like in general. It's nice to have a month's buffer, but that can drain real quick.
I'm approaching this as if you're starting. Yeah. I think if you're starting out, then it's probably good to have a little bit of buffer, but I think we can all agree it's not going to last. It never lasts. Not unless you're crazy.
Yeah, I can't remember. I think I started with maybe like somewhere between 10 and 20 pages before I started my comic, which at that time was about a month and a half, 2 months maybe. But I was also like scribbling them, so they didn't take me very long to do.
Well, I guess maybe I'm kind of a weird mind with starting your comic, in that like I think you should have multiple pages done when you start, but I also think that you should post multiple pages when you first post your comic.
You should start with a chunk.
Yeah.
You should start with like a big chunk so that people can like get a taste for it. Like if you just have your like establishing page, it's not a lot to like grip your readers.
It can be hard to hook people, because it's like, well, I have no idea what this is about or where it's going. I had a friend who once was like, you should have like 6 months worth of updates, and that's fucking ludicrous.
If I had 6 months of updates, I'd just post them at once. You don't understand. If I don't have to wait 6 months to post my comic, I will not wait because I want to get it done.
I think the most I'd go is like maybe like a whole chapter's worth. Like we've been talking about, like that's as far as I'd go. Otherwise,
Oh, but man, if I had a whole chapter done, I would just post the whole chapter. Like, maybe I'm just like really impatient, but like if I had a whole chapter, I would not like withhold that and just make people read it week by week.
No, yeah,
I'd
that
be
makes
like,
sense.
Here's my whole chapter.
Yeah,
Please
yeah.
read it.
I feel that. Yeah, I want to talk to people about stuff. Like that's the one thing I don't like about buffering. It's because like, oh man, look at all this cool stuff I'm working on. I can't show people yet.
But yeah, it's even
people
worse
aren't
than
gonna
that
see it
regular.
until,
Like July.
Yeah, it's even worse than that regular webcomic author thing of like, oh, I'm sitting on so many things that are gonna like have to be drip fed to my audience like over years and years, and it's like with a big enough buffer, like you can see the things. Those things are like physical, and you can look at them, and they're there. It's in comic form already, and you're just like, I think this part of the question about scripts is maybe one we should save for a different episode, but I do very much want to talk about more panels or less panels. Because
More
that
panels or less panels depends on what you're
Well,
doing on the page.
that can definitely like affect pacing, because we've talked about
Yeah.
off the air how like you can't part of the reason pacing in comics is goofy is because you can't control how fast or slow someone is reading your comic, but you can kind of, for lack of a better word, trick your reader. Like what you said before about like whether or not you're including backgrounds affects how much information someone's eye is taking in on the page and how fast that can flow action. With like a lot of small panels or like a lot of big panels or even like panel borders, like lack of a panel border is going to cause someone to like read through panels quicker. Like a wider panel border is going to cause someone to like subconsciously their eyes are going to pause a little bit going from panel to panel.
Yeah.
And
So I think
depending
it does
on
affect
like
pacing, but-
with and also where you put your dialogue and stuff, if you have it all in one big chunk, people are going to spend a lot more time with their eyes on that big speech bubble than if you break it into smaller bubbles throughout a sequence.
Yeah, unrelated, but if you can help it, like don't put like huge paragraphs in your speech bubbles if you can. Like I think I'm just
tiring.
getting to that point where I'm like starting to be like okay with how I'm lettering things. Lettering is like a fucking underappreciated skill in comicking. It's real hard, and yeah, don't put giant paragraphs in speech bubbles that people are gonna have to read. It's not fun.
Break
For all
them into
those who do
smaller
that.
speech bubbles. It makes it easier to digest.
And I just want anyone who is a letterer who happens to be working in comics right now, I just want to say to you, I appreciate you, and I wish you were working for me, but I don't have money. So
I've often
hey,
thought
you know
about that.
I-
Of like one day in the future when I'm working on like bigger comic projects and I'm like relatively more financially stable. Hell yeah, I want to hire a letterer to do some comics for me. Good
Mhm.
lord.
Okay, at the Zombie Dogs asks, if you wanted to have a holiday or season in comic correspond with the real world counterpart, how would you attempt to handle that? Would you even try to pace yourself or just F it and have Christmas in July? Also, how do you keep yourself from posting characters that haven't shown up in the comic yet? Even though it's not a spoiler for what they look like, but you don't want to ruin the in-comic surprise experience. What self-discipline techniques do you use to use or say to yourself?
Ooh.
Which part do we want to tackle first?
So with the holiday and season thing, you know, I haven't done that in my own comic, but I think that if I was going to do an in-universe like a fun event thing, if it didn't have to correspond, like if it wasn't really plot relevant and it would have just be like kind of a fun comic, side comic, I just do that as like a special during the in-world counterpart. Like
Like make it its own mini on the side.
yeah, but if I was going to have a holiday or in season in comic and it was that like exists in our real world and it was relevant to the plot and we were going to be spending some time with that, I think I would just have Christmas in July. Like whenever that happens, I would just let it happen.
Hey, Here's
If it
the
doesn't
thing.
line up, oh well.
I've actually thought about this, like chapters where like something cooler might be happening, like try and maybe like consider that during the winter months, like a chapter where there's like a heat wave or something, consider having that in the summer. The problem with that is that I'm updating it 2 pages a week. That's 8 pages a month. That means if I start my like cold chapter in December when it's gonna be like your holiday cold times, that means only about a fourth of that chapter is gonna be in December, and you're gonna get to like March and April and still have your characters like talking about Christmas and stuff, and
Hmm.
it doesn't like line up mathematically speaking.
Yeah.
So I think maybe the
The only
best way
time
to do that would be to release it all at once, maybe.
Yep.
it only ever work in like maybe strip comics. Really, I don't when it's like not as narrative focused. That's the only time I can see it working.
Manga does this a lot where they do
Otherwise,
like little
Yeah,
little
they do
joke
like
strips. It's
one-offs.
always like characters walking around looking at the snow, looking at shrines and stuff, and being like, "Oh, the holidays are coming." And then one character is like, "I want a new game system." It's like it's always like I feel like that's a constant. Or maybe I'm just remembering like specifically the Boku no Hero one and the Sergeant Frog ones. It's always like about like looking at shrines, like, "What do you want for Christmas?" Like, I hope they say nothing. It's like I want the new PSP.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Alright, second part of this question. How do you keep yourself from posting characters that haven't shown up in the comic yet, even if it's not a spoiler? But you don't want to ruin the in-comic surprise of the experience.
You suffer a whole bunch.
You just kind of cry.
Yeah, you
You share them with your friends.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually right in the middle of this. I kind of like hammered out the final details of like some characters that I've been aware of for like a long time that are coming up relatively soon, and I figured out a way to make like one more relevant, and both of them very cool looking, and I'm just sitting on it. And so now I don't think this is always necessary, but like for these characters specifically, part of the punch is gonna be their first appearance. And if I
Right.
was posting a whole bunch of doodles of them, that would not ruin it, but it would like dampen it a little bit for people who are following me.
Yeah.
So you just suffer and share it with friends privately, maybe,
Yeah, get a private Twitter.
or a Patreon.
Or yeah, post it on Patreon for people like the select few. That's always fun.
just remind yourself that when the time comes, you can unleash a whole chunk of art to the
Yeah, that's always
Mhm.
world. And
satisfying.
yeah,
Like,
just a whole big batch.
like any like self-discipline and techniques, I don't really have any of those. It's just kind of I have like learned my lesson, and so I am not going to do that anymore. And I just kind of designate a place or a person to share your secrets with, because it'll make it less unbearable.
Yeah, I guess it can also depend on where all this like where you're posting this information. Because like I think we've run into a couple times where like not all our readers follow us like on social media half the time.
Oh yeah,
Yep.
that's true.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you can't like I'm a fucking Twitter fiend. I have trouble like the stepping back and realizing like not everybody is all up on every single artist they follow social media and like knowing every single thing that everybody posts at any time because I have Twitter refreshing at literally all hours of the day. So it's and the part of this is part of a bigger not everybody knows everything about your story. And even if you post stuff, not everyone's gonna see it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. There'll always be someone who's surprised by something.
Mm-hmm. Or new
That's why
readers
you
who have never heard of you come across your comic on the Tapastic tags or what have you.
This is why I try to stay away from word of godding anything.
Yeah, because you don't want.
If I'm gonna confirm something, it's gonna be confirmed in comic, because I don't want people to like be confused.
And like miss stuff because they don't follow you on Twitter or Tumblr.
Yeah,
Like stuff that can be necessary to the story.
Yeah, your comic should have everything in it. Like you shouldn't have to like read a whole Wikipedia on your characters to understand what's happening.
I think we got a little bit away there from.
Yeah,
from
that's
pacing,
Yeah, but
side thing.
we're all just really passionate about this subject in particular because it's a symptom of like a, a lot of something we really enjoy as like starting out internet artists, and the more we became very involved in our stories, the more like you don't want to post spoiler characters, so we're all really like melancholy about this topic.
Well, yeah, and I mean, like it's interesting because when you're first starting out, you're like, yeah, I'm just gonna share my cool characters with everybody. But once you start making a comic, you're like, oh, I actually can make comics, and I will make comics. This will be a character that I will eventually have like their big reveal in a comic someday. I don't want to it's a real thing. It's suddenly like an attainable thing, not just like, oh yeah, I have my fun characters, haha, look at how cool they are. And like kind of want to save it.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think I've become more of that even before I really started working on my comic. So I don't have a lot posted. I guess I got that going for me. But
it's very mysterious, Jeff.
It also means I can't talk to a lot of people because I'm like, alas. All right, so moving on to the next question here from @CreaseMarks. What's the difference between print comic pacing and web comic pacing? I think we kind of touched on this a little bit.
Let's say we kind of covered this a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to reiterate, I guess, it's when you're sharing it, because obviously with web comics you're sharing it, you're drip feeding it, whereas with print comics you're kind of just putting it all out there at once.
And I mean, well, and if you're considering like the monthly release, like Cape Comics and stuff, like if you were very dedicated and this was your job, like you could have the same like pacing as a print comic. Like you could put out a new chapter every month. Like you could if you had that like insane stamina and determination. But usually with the webcomic world, it's drip feeding a couple pages at a time into the gaping maws of your readers. So it's like everything in webcomics happens in slow motion.
Yep.
And it's like actually kind of infuriating being like, yes, my comic is only like a 50-page chapter. I'm not going to see the end of this chapter until the middle of summer. You're like, that's so long.
Yeah, it's funny.
Cough.
I'm pretty sure, I don't want to miscredit this. I'm pretty sure a friend of mine, Eve, who does the webcomic Inhibit, once like tweeted like writing and drawing a webcomic is like promising a really cool road trip, and then like getting everybody in the car and then like having everybody get out the car and like crawl to the destination, and you built the car yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
That sounds pretty accurate.
Your pages are like giving them a juice box. It's like really kind of like maddening. You don't think too hard about webcomic time because you get very discouraged.
It hurts. It hurts to think about.
Unless you think that your comic's going to take you 30 years or more, then I think you should probably restructure it a little bit. Unless that's your one story, and you're okay with that.
Unless that's the only story you want to tell, in which case, by all means, do what's best for you.
Not speaking from experience here at all.
Oh my gosh,
Jeff. Moving on.
Yeah, we are coming up on an hour, I think, and I don't know if we want too many.
Really?
Yeah, a little bit. I don't know how many like hour and 20 minutes episodes we wanna.
I didn't think it was going that long.
Yeah, dude.
Oh.
So let's like kind of like lightning round these last 4.
Okay.
From @TurdGolem. Obviously, depends to some degree on the story being told, but do any of the hosts have strong feelings about flashbacks?
I don't know how I feel about flashbacks yet because I still don't know if I'm gonna do them or not. So.
I have mixed feelings on flashbacks. I think they can accomplish some really cool things. I don't think you should rely on them for character
Yeah.
development.
Yeah.
Like I shouldn't have
Yeah.
to. We shouldn't have to flashback. And this is something I've come to terms with writing some of my other comics. One of my comics, a lot of the themes and plot is like comes from the character's past, and like the a lot of the themes are like about how your past shapes you and all that. But that doesn't mean every time a character talks about their past, you have to launch into a full-fledged flashback. Some things you can just talk and reveal in conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is very true. This is very true. Subtlety is key. I mean, I do think flashbacks can work if they're done right. Um, I mean, I know there's some of those, like, in pacing wise, because like flashbacks can really interrupt the pacing, especially depending on where they come in.
In the
I
middle of a
think
fight
the times
scene.
In the middle
Here's
of
my
fight
12
scene,
Here's my
Oda.
12 chapter flashback.
I think the biggest example of that like is in One Piece during the fucking Drum Island arc where like Luffy goes to punch Wapol and then we immediately flash back to Chopper's whole backstory, which takes like 8 chapters and then like cuts back and Luffy's punching Wapol in the face and it's like, wait, where were we? You stopped
Their whole
stopped
life
it
flashes
for
back.
8 chapters to tell this backstory. You can't just jump us back into an action scene.
Yeah, but like I think the biggest thing is don't rely on flashbacks to like make your characters intriguing, to make them like relevant to the current plot. Like don't rely on flashbacks.
Yeah.
They can be cool though.
I would say the only time I've ever really seen it work is if like they're like just small snippets, like maybe even just like a panel or two during a page, like as
Mhm.
if let's say a character like has PTSD or can like have visions of some sort. Those are like the times then something can kind of cut back to something else or can show off another piece of information that could delve into that character a little bit without it being overtly long or big
Yeah,
and
without it
taking
being
up
like,
the whole
okay,
chapter.
kids, we're doing a flashback now. Like, I really like those kind of like just quick, like maybe a few panels, because that it
Yeah.
feels almost like a memory, like they're thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or
exactly.
God,
Just in the
so
moment.
not to spend too much time on this question, but
Lightning round.
Penny Dreadful dedicating an entire episode every season to like a Vanessa flashback specifically irked the hell out of me. Like,
Yeah.
and I mean
man.
that's an hour-long drama. It's hard to like compare that to webcomics and stuff, but like to really halt the story once a season for the same character in a huge, super involved flashback that all seem to essentially accomplish the same thing. Maybe don't do that.
Yeah.
No.
All right, let's continue the slowest lightning round of all time.
Okay, so at McSpoofy asks, how do you schedule time in a day to just sit down and do your webcomic, especially since it can sometimes be considered a part-time job, and having work and school can be a full-time thing, making it a little hard to find free time in the day.
Weekends.
I usually think of
Time.
chopping your pages up into doable bites, like doing the sketch in one time. You don't have to sit down and do whole pages at once. You can do your layouts and then do your lines and then do your colors and lettering all at separate times, and that can make things really manageable because instead of sitting down for like one 6-hour stretch, what you're doing is chopping it up into manageable 1 or 2 hour stretches over the course of a couple days, especially if you're only updating one page a week.
Yeah, I've actually started doing that, and it actually has helped me a lot. Like just focusing on doing like one thing that won't take very long over the course of a few days. It really does help make it easier and more manageable.
Yeah. And back when I used to do OCTs, I actually kind of had to make my own little sort of breakdown schedule so then I could have each of my so many pages rounds done for the month or 3 weeks or however long it was, on top of also working part-time. And it was really just kind of like I think the best way is to like work out your script, work out how many pages you're gonna need for that, and then breaking down how many like stuff you can do for throughout the weeks and month. Although for me, bad example, going against what Brent said, I would actually figure out how many pages I need to do per day.
Well, that's because
But-
OCTs are killer. So
You know, like comics boot camp.
yeah. Also, just as a quick, if you are in school and you're trying to do a webcomic too, do not put your webcomic in front of schoolwork. School is more important.
Yes.
Focus on school and staying healthy. Your webcomic will always be there.
Don't stress yourself out. Cut back to even just once per week if you're doing more than that.
Mm-hmm. All right.
All right. And from at Mordsec, I almost read it as Mordesk.
Oh yeah, how about
How
that?
would you handle how would you handle getting from major event A to major event B without waffling or too many montages?
I'm trying to think about how I do this, and it's usually just make a whole bunch of tiny subplots.
Yeah, that's actually how I do it too. Like, to get from one major event to another major event, it's like we'll just have things happen that will lead them to that next event. Maybe you're thinking about
That's
like
important.
maybe you're thinking about like things like traveling,
Mm-hmm.
which I think it's okay to just be like, and then they traveled, because like if there's not a whole lot happening during the traveling part, I don't think you really need to focus on it too much.
Yeah, you don't need to show everything that happens. There can be these assumed breaks in time, and I mean maybe that's just
Yeah.
me. I have a lot of them, a little bit, especially in between chapters. A lot of times it's not uncommon in Paradise for like a week or two have passed. I think the biggest break is in between chapters 4 and 5. There's about like a 3-week difference, which I cannot
Mhm.
remember if I actually like acknowledged in the canon of the comic or not. I had meant to put a line in there about it had been 3 weeks, but you know, that's part of it. Acknowledge how much time has passed, but you don't have to show every little bit.
I think that the way I see this question is almost kind of thinking of like how do you speed up or slow down between those 2 points.
Mm-hmm.
I think obviously like if you're like slowing it down too much, then it's gonna be like maybe you're worried about filler. But if you're speeding up too much, then it's like are you just not giving enough time for the characters to breathe and the story to kind of relax a little bit so then everyone else can kind of catch up on what's going on plot wise.
Mm-hmm.
I actually kind of wrote down an example here, if you'll bear with me. So let's say you have a group of bank robbers, all right? And major event 1 is them planning to rob said bank, and then the second event is them actually doing it. So, since they're planning, they can probably take a lot of their time doing that. That can take up a lot of time. But if you want to pace it up like really fast, then obviously like using a montage and kind of visual storytelling of them scoping out the bank, getting a van, getting their weapons ready and costumes or masks or whatever. You can just do that as a montage of like a few panels here and there, and that could just cut down all the time and then get directly to it. That can work. And if you want to slow it down, the best example would probably be to actually kind of have time for the characters to develop so you can kind of get to know them before they go and do the bank robbery. If that's what's the important part. Like, I don't know, Tony, the bank robber, let's call him Tony. You know, he might be pulling out the map and marking down like each of the important locations for security guards are, cameras, and like what the best route to take is. And maybe, I don't know, let's say another bank robber, Veronica, let's call her Veronica, decides that they should plan for SWAT team stuff and isn't really a fan of Tony's like flashy and maybe not best planned out routes are, and maybe thinks that they should be more outfitted. And I think that in that example, you can kind of slow down time, develop those characters before that moment, if that's what you're wanting to do. So really, it kind of depends on what you're focusing on. That's what's important about pacing. If you just want to have your plot points come in and go, and that's the point, like, oh, the point is obviously the bank robbery, not the robbers, then you can go for the montage. If you want to focus more on character stuff with these bank robbers because they are the protagonist of the story, then you should probably spend more time with that. So really, it's depending on your focus, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, dude.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Final question from @RadoKalingeso. Hiya, I'd like to know how the hosts feel about tone shift pacing. We talked about this a little bit before we hit record. Like major tone shifts, ones that are like especially noticeable from like your, laughing, goofing around moments to your like darker, more emotionally heartstring tugging moments, should be gradual enough so that it doesn't feel like it's slapping the audience in the face. With tonal whiplash, that can cause a whole other host of problems.
I think
One of my favorite examples of like good tone shifts in anything is probably Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. Because they're like that series consistently is able to get away with like horrifying, grotesque, upsetting, emotional like trauma, and then like slapstick goofy jokes like in the next scene, and it doesn't feel like whiplash. Like it feels natural, it feels normal.
so like that's probably one of the best examples I can think of. They're able to balance it really well.
I think it's you have to kind of build up to it a little bit. If you don't want it to be abrupt, then you should probably give some time for those tones to kind of set in, and then eventually start rising up the new ones to kind of replace that tune. Going slower is probably better than going quicker, I would think.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's
Yep.
That's enough talking about pacing. I believe it is my turn to bring the webcomic recommendation of the week for y'all.
What are we all gonna read this week, Brent?
This week I'm gonna recommend Larkspur by Grace Mulcahy @GCMulk on Twitter. I'm bringing it up because I actually just reread it from the beginning. It just finished up its first part, its first chapter. So it's got like a prologue and a whole first chapter out for you to read. It's about a girl gang in like a post-nuclear Philadelphia. It's not like total post-apocalyptic. It's more like a whole bunch of people who are clearly affected by like a certain level of radiation poisoning. A lot of the characters have mutations of sort. One of my favorite things about the comic actually is the sense of character design, how everybody's mutations are ever so different. Your main character is this lady. She's got a whole bunch of eyes. There are characters with like, multiple fingers and stuff, but it's not like...
Oh, I just read this.
And
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, keep going. It's good. This is a good comic.
But yeah, I like the sense of character design a lot. The art is really, really good looking. Like, there's a lot of really nice colors and really professionally. I love how the faces are drawn a lot. And, yeah.
It's really cool. I'm excited to see where it's going.
It's, this one might be a little one that's better for binge reading as opposed to reading week to week, in my experience. But, your prologue is kind of a flash forward, and then it immediately flashes back to our characters where they kind of started. And yeah, I am really excited to see how this girl gang got formed. The first chapter just introduced it's got a villain stinger at the end of it. Really, really pretty man. Really excited.
Oh boy.
So yeah, go read Larkspur.
Alrighty.
Yeah, right, y'all. I think that's gonna do it for us this week. Apologies if it sounds different at all. Like I said, at the beginning of the episode we had some technical difficulties and we're using like a different program, sort of dealy. So I'm hoping everything sounds pretty kosher. But if there's any sort of differences in the audio quality, that's the reason why. Thank you all for continuing to send in your questions and stuff. By the by, you guys have really interesting things to ask on topics. If your question hasn't been answered, by the way, it's because we thought it might not have gelled with that week's topic, but we saved it in this kind of separate column, and I believe the idea is if if we have like a whole bunch of kind of like random questions that still pertain to webcomics but maybe didn't pertain to that week's topic, we'll have like a general kind of like leftovers episode where we answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, so don't like worry if you didn't hear your question answered on air.
We saw it.
Yeah, we saw it and we've saved it, and at some point we're gonna answer it using our infinite wisdom about webcomics. But
Our infallible wisdom about.
infallible, definitely our invincible webcomic opinions. Anything else you guys want to add?
I love you.
Oh, Jeff.
Aw. Well, Jeff loves you guys. All right. Until next time, I've been Brent.
I've been Amber.
I've been Jeff. Play us out,
And
Brent.
we do this for free. I guess I'm playing us out this week.
Well, you always play it. You play us out every week.
I
It's your
guess.
song.
I guess I do. Yes, I do.